Hello and welcome back to my channel. Did you just start playing in stage 4 of the World Championship? H1 has started and you have no clue what to do? Well, then I have something for you today because today we are ranking the H1 leaders and wonders and I'm very excited to do it. Yeah, but it has to be said, for H1 I do think it already gets quite a bit more difficult, even more difficult to rank those leaders and wonders, because for HA I do think it's a bit more easily possible to compare maybe the different leaders. For example, you can compare how much science do I get out of Aristotle, how much out of Confucius, how much out of Boudica, and then all players have the same starting position, but starting with H1 each player will have a different setup, and how strong a leader or wonder is of course completely depends on what setup you are having on your civilization already. So it's a bit more difficult to compare all of those. It also maybe depends a little bit on your play style, which are the situations that you get in very often, and then some leaders and wonders will maybe be especially strong for this particular setup. But I will just be ranking those on how I feel how strong they are, and yeah, let's just see how the list will look at the end. For 2 or 3 cards I'm not fully decided yet where I will put them, but let's just see where they will land. And also, of course, to remember, this list is thought for 3-player games, but I will mention when maybe a card is particularly stronger or weaker in another player count. And yeah. Alright, then now without further ado, let's get started. And of course, now maybe also with starting with eight, beginning with H1, maybe also already with H8, it's a bit a question of how often is a leader useful, and then, but also how strong can a leader be if the situation is perfect. And I try to take both of those things into account and maybe also talk a little bit about which leader is maybe not that often useful but can be extremely powerful in the right moment. So I will try to also talk a little bit about this. Alright, now without further ado, let's get started, and we will start with Frederick Barbarossa. And I do think he is quite a powerful leader. He lets you build military units very efficiently. Per activation of him, you are saving 1 civil action, 1 resource, and 1 food. And now I will already say where I will put him. I will put him in A tier. Maybe you remember my list of which leaders and wonders I had how often after the World Championship 2023. There Barbarossa together with Bach was actually the leader that I had the most often in my World Championship games, which is definitely interesting, and maybe that was a bit of an outlier, or not where a bit over what the amount that maybe has to be expected, but still I do think Barbarossa is quite strong. Per activation of him, you're getting 1 civil action, 1 resource, and 1 food. That is basically the amount that Saladin plus a fully activated Ashoka would be giving you. Meaning every activation actually gives you a lot of value, and if you only do 2 activations, you maybe have already covered an amount of value from a leader that would be good enough for 4 turns. So even if you do 2 activations of him and then don't use him for a while, he can still be quite powerful. And of course, he has a lot of potential if you maybe build your civilization in a way that fits him, maybe with some food production, additional military actions, happy faces, then you can get a lot of activations out of him and he will create a lot of value for you. Can maybe be very strong in a colonization game, maybe very nice when you go for a strength push. So there he can be extremely powerful, but I also think in a relatively normal game state, Barbarossa can already be quite fine if the timing is somewhat right. If the event deck has just flipped, it's maybe the middle of H1, we have a bit of food saved up and you would now start building some military anyway. I definitely think it's often a good idea to just take Barbarossa, build the military a lot more efficiently with him, maybe get 2 or even 3 activations out of him, and then he has already given you quite a nice amount of value. Also, Barbarossa can be a very nice transitional leader, because if you maybe if the event deck is moving a bit more slowly and the military only has to be built at the end of H1, then it's even better. You can take him, use him 2 or 3 times, and then if there's an early H2 leader, you can replace him, and the amount of value that he has given you in the short amount of time will be extremely strong, and a lot stronger than what most of the other H1 leaders will be able to offer. So nice transitional leaders, a leader that can be extremely strong if you go for a bit of a special game. with military or colonization, but also in a normal game he can give you just a very decent amount of value, and with that I will end up putting him in A tier. After that World Championship 2023, maybe I would have even put him in S tier after seeing how much I used him, and but I do think maybe that would be a bit too much, but A tier I think he definitely deserves. Then we have Columbus, and for Columbus it of course completely depends on what military cards you have available. If you don't have any colony available, of course he doesn't do anything. If you have a very strong colony available, maybe Vast Territory 1, or you get lucky and draw an H2 colony, then he's definitely S tier. And so for a while I thought, alright, then maybe Columbus is just a very nice leader to fit in B tier. However, I do think that recently I started to value Columbus a bit more, even more, and I more and more often was willing to actually go for the Columbus gamble, meaning going for Columbus when you actually have no colony in hand. That, of course, can potentially backfire. It's of course better maybe if you at least already have a backup colony, maybe one that you don't ideally want to use, but you could go for if maybe you don't get another colony. But no, maybe it's just as maybe he grew higher on me because I really like it to have an HA leader that just produces some economical value and keep that leader for quite a long time. And then if you get an H1 leader only at the end of H1, then what Columbus can give you, similar to how Barbarossa also can work in that way, can give you just an immense value with getting a colony for free, and then maybe you can get an early H2 leader, and then again Columbus has given you a lot of value for the amount of turns that you had him at the end, and then maybe you can allow to wait for one turn, and sometimes you will get lucky, get an early H2 colony, he will get even stronger. And now, even if you, after colonizing with Columbus, have no leader for maybe 3 turns or something, it's not too bad. For example, if you colonize the wealthy territory 1, which is definitely not the ideal colony, then you get 6 resources, 3 blue tokens, and then if you compare to Isabella, she would take 6 turns in order to produce that amount of value. And that is even not the ideal colony for Columbus, but of course it has to not be forgotten that Columbus doesn't give you the civil action back when going for a new leader, and a civil action in H2 is definitely worth maybe 2, maybe sometimes even 3 resources, so with that it gets put more into perspective again. But still, with leaders like Ashoka, Hammurabi, I mean, with Hammurabi you don't get that many draws, but also Boudica, Confucius, I really like to just take on Columbus in hand, sometimes even without a colony, and then just keep the HA leader and go for Columbus, and with that I'm at the moment putting him in A tier. Because I do think he is quite strong, especially because in more than half of the games, in 3 and 4 player games, there will be a Suez Canal in the game. And if you just get one colony for free with Columbus, out of the sudden the Suez Canal is already a very decent wonder. If you then maybe somehow win one more colony, maybe even without setting up for it, just along the way, the Suez Canal can already be quite strong if you then at some point draw an H2 colony. And also because of that, I do think Columbus is quite nice, and even in games where the Suez Canal is in there, he is especially strong. Then we have the next leader, and that leader is Genghis Khan, who allows you to use infantry units for cavalry units for the purpose of tactics, and if you are one of the 2 strongest at the end of your turn, you score 3 culture with him. And Genghis Khan can definitely work decent, but I'm not really the biggest fan of him, and I will end up putting him in C tier, even with the tendency to rather put him in D tier than in B tier, but I think for now I will keep him in C tier. And yeah, I just think there are certainly situations where it is very strong to go for Genghis Khan, and he is definitely not bad or something, but overall, compared to what the other H1 leaders offer, I'm really not the biggest fan. He allows you maybe to go for a heavy cavalry tactic with only warriors or swordsmen, meaning that you can get an amount of 4 out of your tactic, but doing so is also possible without him. Maybe you can just go for knights and then go for phalanx tactic, maybe even 2 medieval army tactics, and then you also get 3 or 4 out of your tactic. Of course, you can get that amount of out of your tactic without having invested anything into any military techs, only with warriors. But if you are only on warriors, then at some point I think the amount of strength that you're having, even with the heavy cavalry tactic, might not be enough, and you might have to go for swordsman anyway, and it's not bad. You can upgrade all of those warriors, you have a relatively efficient tactic. If you then get a great wall, it's definitely a very nice combination and all, but yeah, just the ability to maybe more reliably get 4 an amount of 4 strength out of your tactic, and then the only other benefit is giving a bit of culture. And of course, it's not bad to get 3 culture, but I do think in H1, early H2, there's at this point culture is not that important. It's definitely not irrelevant. It can be nice to not be on the back foot going into H3, but it's maybe not the most important thing, and so I will end up putting him in C tier because he can definitely be useful. You don't always have all tactics available. Maybe you have the heavy cavalry but no legion tactic or something, and then you can just very easily activate this heavy cavalry tactic. But I do not go for Genghis Khan that often, and think that other leaders can just give you better benefits. And also Genghis Khan just needs the right tactics, so he's not even a leader that you can just maybe doesn't give that much, but you can always go for him. But you actually need the right tactic to even make nice work out of him. Then the next leader that we are having here is Eleanor. Eleanor, when I first started playing, I thought is maybe not the greatest leader, but I definitely think she's a very fine leader and can actually be quite strong, not that rarely. If you yeah, so Eleanor I will put in B tier. I do think it's just a very solid leader, can potentially be quite strong. You will draw some additional cards when you seed events, you will score some culture when you discard events, and then when you replace Eleanor with an H2 leader, you get 3 instead of only 1 civil action back. That's just a very nice package, especially in early H2. I do think those additional draws are quite valuable. You're a lot more likely to maybe get an H2 tactic, which can make a big difference. You may be getting some cards earlier, and with that can more easily decide in which direction you want to go. But of course you are kind of forced, or you're not forced, but you really want to push the event deck, and Eleanor doesn't give any strength benefits. So if you're playing then against leaders like Joan of Arc, Zizka, Nostradamus, you maybe seed a lot but get potentially punished by strength events. So that's of course a bit of a downside. And the culture, when I'm saying that maybe the culture of Genghis Khan is not too important, then from Eleanor it's maybe also not the most important, but culture is definitely not completely bad to have also in H1. So if you're able to discard 3 or 4 cards every turn, that definitely adds up and maybe gives you a bit of a lead going into H3. And then because of her last ability to get 3 instead of only 1 civil action back, Eleanor is also a very nice transitional leader, similar to Columbus or potentially also Barbarossa, where you just have an HA leader for most of H1, and then at the end of H1 you go for Eleanor, and then let's say in 2 or 3 turns you already go for an H2 leader, and then you have in a relatively short amount, in addition to her early H2 draws and a bit of culture, also gain 2 civil actions, which is definitely better compared to if you maybe would have gone for Saladin and then replaced him very quickly. So I also really like it to pick Eleanor, keep my HA leader, go for her relatively late in H1, and then maybe go for an H2 leader if I think the time is right. But there are it hasn't been that rarely that I had Eleanor, but I actually really didn't want to go for that H2 leader because discarding 4 cards and maybe getting more draws at the next turn is just not that bad of a benefit. And so I think she's a very solid leader, and I will put her in B tier. Then the next leader is Gutenberg. And Gutenberg had maybe a little bit of an up and down for me, because for some time when I really started playing the game, I didn't really like Gutenberg that much, and I also think some others maybe didn't like him that much, but then he really showed his potential, especially in 2-player games, and also if you think about him, what amount of value he is giving you, it definitely is just very powerful. He gives you a civil action, basically what Saladin is giving you, but also 2 culture, and then sometimes even a resource or science discount. So if you are really able to make use out of his ability in a useful way every turn, he's just an enormous, very powerful leader. But I don't know why, for some reason, I just I have the feeling that I go for him very, very rarely, and that it's not that often that there's a nice situation to go for him. Maybe I have to set myself more up often for him, more often up for him, to then get this nice amount of value out of him. But the problem is sometimes there's the situation, there's an alchemy, there's Gutenberg, but you have the option to just go for 2 alchemy upgrades immediately. And if you would have go for Gutenberg, you would just start scrapping the alchemy, then at the next turn maybe developing it if you really want to stretch out his actions. And then it sometimes can just be better to go for the alchemy upgrades immediately, getting the upgrades done quicker, and with that having more science a lot earlier available. So ideally, you use Gutenberg when you to maybe go for something like alchemy, but at the same time, like doing some other stuff. Sometimes it's possible to maybe set the iron upgrades and the alchemy upgrades up at the same point. That works very nicely with Gutenberg, or it's a bit of a more military heavy game where you always have to keep up in military, but you can maybe slowly build an alchemy together with Gutenberg. So that those situations are maybe the best for Gutenberg, and there he's definitely very strong. But especially in 3 and 4 player game, I just didn't find that often the time or to use him very nicely. It just somehow doesn't work out that often for me. Maybe it's a mistake in my play. Maybe I have to set myself up a bit better for him more often. But because at the moment I have the feeling I'm really not going for him very often, I will actually put him in C tier before Genghis Khan. But yeah, he can be a very strong leader. So if you have the right setup for it, or if the timing is right with him and the alchemy and what else you have to do, definitely go for him. And maybe if I manage to get to yeah, to make him work more often again, maybe he will soon also climb again in the list. However, it has to be said that for 2 player games, I do think Gutenberg definitely goes way up there, maybe in A tier, maybe even higher, but probably something like A tier, because that's a lot more easily possible to just build a lot of urban buildings, also a lot more easily possible to build some printing presses, build some culture production, and then you can really make use out of Gutenberg a lot without really being punished sometimes. So yeah, with that, I think also you have the Acropolis more often, so it's more easily possible to also go for 3 labs, which can be work quite nicely with Gutenberg to get a lot of activations out of him. And also Gutenberg can sometimes be a nice transitional leader, because if you get him in the middle or end of H1, then set up maybe a bit of alchemy and then replace him, he also has given you a very nice amount of value at a relatively short time. So maybe it's a bit harsh to put him as C tier just because if he works, he really gives you a very nice amount of value, but just very often I end up with a different leader, and because of that, he will end up in C tier. Next, we have Isabella, who without any setup just gives you a resource production and 2 blue tokens, and then also gives you the ability to have a benefit in colonization with the ability to pay resources in a colonization bonus. And now, Isabella, the advantage of her is, of course, she works without really any setup. The problem is, if you are not making use out of her colonization ability, then I do think the 1 resource plus the 2 blue tokens is just a bit underwhelming compared to what other leaders from H1 give you. For example, Leonardo maybe gives you a resource and a science per turn. Those strength leaders really offer some very nice benefits. Barbarossa gives you a resource, a food, and a civil action just with only 1 activation. So just for the 1 resource production, I do think she's quite underwhelming. Can still be nice. Maybe if you have Hippocrates or Alexander and just wants to get a quick replacement for your HA leader, then she just gives you a nice benefit. The resources might help you snowballing a little bit, so it's not completely bad, but just a little bit underwhelming. However, if you maybe go for a colonization game, with the Suez Canal maybe being the game, and then her colonization ability can of course be quite nice. Nonetheless, I do think compared to the other H1 leaders, she's just not that great, and I will also put her in C tier, I think between Gutenberg and Genghis Khan, just because only her resources and the 2 blue tokens I do think is a bit underwhelming, not completely bad, but I do think the other H1 leaders offer better benefits. So if you are not making use out of the colonization ability, you really have to ask yourself, is Isabella really the best leader that I can be getting, or is maybe another leader potentially more valuable for you, for me? But of course, if she is available for 1 civil action and you don't know when you get another leader, definitely go for her, and she then just gives you some safe value. Next, we have Joan of Arc, and for Joan of Arc, I was a bit thinking about where to put her. She's definitely a very nice leader, a very nice package of different abilities, getting a bit of strength with your temples, getting a little bit of culture, getting an additional military action, which is maybe the most important part of her abilities, or at least a very nice part, and then also getting a bit of event deck knowledge with being able to look at the top card before your turn. And now, with that, I thought maybe at the high end of B tier or the lower end of A tier that I would put her. I do think at the end I like her enough that I will put her in A tier, but behind Barbarossa and Columbus. The good thing about Joan of Arc is she doesn't really require that much setup. Of course, ideally you want to have that free temple, but that's not that rarely that you maybe get a free temple and then she is giving you one strength. But even without a temple, she can be a very fine leader. A military action, especially if you're only on 2 military actions, I think can be quite valuable. And also the event deck knowledge should not be underestimated. And then maybe you also always have the chance to build a religion or theology or maybe an organized religion later on to also get a bit of strength out of her, so she doesn't require a lot of setup, works quite fine most of the times. And then if you have something like theology, she gives you 2 additional strength, which is quite nice, a military action, a bit of culture, event tech knowledge, and I do think that is just a very nice package. And so I think I will put her at the lower end of A tier, just because it's just, I think, very pleasant to play with her, and then also knowing what event is on top, that definitely can sometimes also lead to a bit of value and helps you how you want to play your turn. Then next we have Leonardo da Vinci. And Leonardo is, of course, gives you some very nice economical benefits. Ideally, you can maybe get a science and then also 1 resource per turn, or maybe sometimes not possible to develop a technology every turn, but almost up to a resource per turn. Sometimes it's even possible to go with Leonardo in something like scientific method or journalism, and then he gives you 2 science per turn, which is a very strong amount of value for an H1 leader, but of course that happens rather rarely and cannot be expected when you take him. And I do think he is definitely very fine. And I also thought about for him maybe B tier or A tier. Him I will put at the end in B tier because you need a bit of setup. You need this alchemy or printing press. You don't have those technologies every time. Taking him without having those available is a bit of a gamble. So you can't just take him every time easily. If you have the alchemy, he's definitely, if that is a given, then he might be in A tier, but because it is not a given, I will put him in B tier, but it's just very useful. I definitely like getting a bit of additional science, and also the resources are quite helpful. So just a very useful leader that you definitely should highly consider if you have alchemies or printing presses, and it can definitely be worthwhile to actively decide to get into those technologies, maybe even over something like iron when you know that you have a good chance of getting Leonardo. So I will put him at the top end of B tier. And so I just think he is completely solid and gives you a very nice amount of value, economical value. The next leader is maybe one that is quite difficult to rank, and one that I also started to like a bit more recently, because I made, after the 2 last World Championships, those videos where I just looked at which leader and wonders I had how often. And from the H1 leaders, Michelangelo is definitely the leader that I had the least, which definitely could be an argument to maybe put him in D tier or C tier. And maybe I would have put him in D tier or C tier a year ago or something like this, but I do think maybe I have slept on him a little bit, and maybe also some other players. But recently I went more often for him, but I also saw other strong players going more often for Michelangelo. And Michelangelo, for newer players, can sometimes be a little bit of a trap, because you can very easily generate a lot of culture with him. I actually remember the first game of Through the Ages that I ever played was online with the app against the II, and I had Hanging Gardens. I then went for Michelangelo. I saw the St. Peter's Basilica, went for that, and I was running away with the culture, and I thought, I have broken the game with this combination, and then I got completely destroyed in H3, and that is maybe a trap that newer players easily can fall into, that you really try to maximize the culture output, delay developing your economy, and then in H3 you just get hit by a big war, or just the other players will catch up with impacts and wonders. So because of that, if you are behind this stage, then you maybe say, oh, I have to be careful with Michelangelo. But the actual strong part about this ability is probably not a culture production, but to take wonders cheaper and also get one resource when doing so. The culture production can also definitely be quite nice, and the ceiling of Michelangelo is of course extremely high. If you have some early iron, and then maybe go for St. Peter's Basilica, which could be a useful wonder anyway, have already a free religion, you already get 3 culture, maybe you have a nice way to set up a drama or then just another religion, then you get 5 culture per turn out of your leader, and then all of the way you can maybe just build 4 or 5 wonders. Sometimes you can have those crazy games where you can maybe go up to 7 wonders, and then you have just tons of wonders, and the benefit of having a lot of wonders is that you get a lot of value from them without requiring any workers. It's basically impossible to destroy them, so you just have a very strong passive income, passive abilities, and that I do think can be quite strong. So I at the end will now put Michelangelo also in B tier, maybe between Leonardo and Eleanor, because while it's definitely true that it doesn't work every time, but if you just have some iron production, which is not that rarely, and you definitely can consider just picking him, especially if there's still some H1 wonders also left, and then being able to take those wonders for cheaper, and then also H2. In H2 you can a lot more easily take strong wonders like Ocean Liner Service and Harvard College, and then I do think the wonder grabbing ability is just extremely strong, and his ceiling, the amount that you can get out of him, is just completely absurd. Yeah, but because it's not that easily possible to get that high ceiling every time, I will put him in B tier, and I have not that long ago maybe I would have put him lower, but I do think even if you only take 2 wonders with him and get a bit of culture production, that can still be a very nice amount of value, and I also see other strong players more often go for Michelangelo nowadays, so I will put him in B tier here. Then we have Nostradamus. And Nostradamus is a very useful leader that is almost never completely bad. Of course, you kind of want to seed a lot, so if you have only 2 military actions and no events in hand, you have to be a bit careful. But even then, he's giving you some knowledge about the event deck and also some additional culture production. If you have him, then ideally, as said, you want to maybe have at least 3 military actions in a 3-player game. It's not that rarely that you will be part of the open borders agreement, so I do think it's quite often that you have an additional military action from somewhere, and then I think Nostradamus is just very, very pleasant to play. Seeding, being protected against being the weakest, getting some knowledge, pushing the event deck forward, and generating a bit of a culture lead, I do think is a very useful ability. You don't really need a lot of setup or something, you can just take him and get his benefits, and because of this, that he definitely deserves to be an A tier. And actually, Nostradamus, together with Joan of Arc, is the leader that I had the most often in the last 2 World Championships. Just very useful most of the times, and I will put him in A tier. I think maybe here. I do think he is quite strong, and especially in 3-player game with the open borders agreement, you often have the 3rd military action. If you already have the 3rd military action, I often prefer Nostradamus over a leader like Joan of Arc and Jan Žižka. If you are on 2 military actions, then I think you should definitely more highly consider going for Joan of Arc and Jan Žižka, and Nostradamus can be a bit tricky, but because you are that often on 3 military actions, and I also think I'm a bit more often on monarchy than some other players, I think then Nostradamus is just extremely pleasant to play, and having that knowledge about the event deck is quite nice. You can maybe try to elect him at a time just when the event deck has flipped or is about to flip, so that for the next event deck you actually have the full knowledge, because I do think it makes a difference whether you have the full knowledge about the complete event deck, or because if there's only one unknown event out of the set, you have to consider all of the events again for that one event. So having complete knowledge that events like Rebellion or Raids are either in there or not in there is extremely helpful. and so I will put him in A tier. The next leader that we are having is Saladin, and now Saladin I think is just extremely useful and doesn't require basically any setup. And because of that, I'm not sure if it feels right, but at the end I decided to actually put him in S tier. Because I do think the additional civil action is actually quite useful and you don't have to do anything for it. You can just take Saladin, have the additional civil action, and that will really help you building up your civilization. And you don't need any setup for it, and you always have the chance to also take 2 strength. That of course is not ideal, but you only do this probably in a situation where you think that the 2 strength is more valuable than the civil action. So at the times when you will take the strength from Saladin, hopefully it will be a time where it's actually extremely useful for you. I do think weaker players sometimes make the mistake of taking the strength of Saladin too often just to maybe avoid being the weakest, but if you don't have knowledge that there are some very bad events coming, then I think I would most of the times just take the civil action, get the guaranteed value instead of gambling. If of course the strength makes the difference between being weakest or strongest, then it can definitely a bit more highly considered to just take the strength, even if you don't have knowledge that strength events are coming. S tier is definitely a bit high, but one reason to put him in S tier is also that he is maybe the H1 leader that you really want to have the most during the early H1, which is especially the case when you maybe have a leader like Hippocrates, Homer, or Alex, or also Moses, or some other leaders that are replaced quickly. In the early game, Saladin is definitely often taken for 2 civil actions, sometimes even for 3 civil actions, maybe especially in 2-player games, but also in 3 and 4-player games I have players seen reaching very heavily out for Saladin to get that additional civil action going. So he's extremely useful in the early game, and the other H1 leaders, often you need a bit of setup for them, or the strength only really gets relevant when the event deck is flipped, which sometimes takes at least a little while. So just getting the economical benefit without any setup, I think, is just very nice for Saladin. And so I will put him in S tier, and then later in H2, I do think he's still very useful, because in H2, civil action just starts to get more valuable. The yellow cards are offering you more benefits, and if then Saladin's additional civil action results in maybe being able to take an additional yellow card, maybe something like, I don't know, rich land, then you just get basically 3 resources out of him. Of course, sometimes it will be the case that the civil action is not that useful, but because he basically works every time, and is also quite strong. I do think the civil action is maybe similar to what Leonardo can offer you from the amount of value, but Leonardo requires setup, Saladin doesn't, also gives you the flexibility to take some strength, and having additional civil actions is just extremely pleasant. So maybe it's a bit too, putting him in S tier, maybe it's a bit too high for him, but at the end I wanted at least one leader in S tier. Maybe it could also be fine to put him in A tier and say that he isn't really a whole tier before the other leaders, but at the end I will make the decision to put him into S tier. Then we have one last leader left, and that is Jan Žižka, who is of course known as a very threatening and very powerful leader. And he is definitely powerful and gives you some useful benefits. Nonetheless, I do think that, in my opinion, Jan Žižka is a bit overrated, at least by some players. And because I have seen some tier lists when I was in this tier list site from, I don't know, I just saw some tier lists, and Jan Žižka was very often at the top in S tier. And I definitely can understand it. There are some very overwhelming Jan Žižka games. But still, I think he also requires a bit of setup or the right tactic. Ideally, maybe the medieval army or phalanx tactic. Then you can really, with only 4 units, get an amount of value, get maybe something like 6 out of the tactic that you are having. Again, compared to Genghis Khan, who most of the times just allows you to get 4 out of the tactic. He doesn't give you an additional military action. The culture that you get from him is somewhat conditional. So here we can maybe see that Žižka definitely has the clear edge over Genghis Khan. But if you only have the legion tactic, or the fighting band tactic, then you get a bit of additional strength, you get some culture, you have the military action. If you are only in 2 military actions, that's definitely valuable, but as said, more often it will also be the case that you maybe are already in 3 military actions. So I do think Jan Žižka, the very powerful Jan Žižka, is not that often, or I mean, the setup that you're needing is not that big. It often will be the time that the medieval army tactic will be available. So yeah, he can definitely be extremely helpful to make sure that you are the strongest. Nonetheless, compared to a leader like Barbarossa, who gives you a very clear economical benefit, and thanks to the economical benefit helps you maybe setting up for a bit more strength, I will actually rate Jan Žižka behind him and also behind some of the other H1 leaders. The question, I think I will just put him next to Joan of Arc. The question is, should I put him before Joan of Arc or behind him? Behind her? And it's a close call for me. At the end, I think I will just put him behind her, which is maybe questionable because he most of the times gives you more culture reduction in Joan of Arc, but a culture reduction at this stage maybe not the most important thing. And then the amount of strength, if you're getting 6 out of, for example, 3 medieval army tactics, it's also possible to get 4, with having 4 units, just 4 out of the medieval army tactics, so it's giving you something like 2 strength. And Joan of Arc also can give you that amount of strength, maybe not that often, but sometimes even more. And then I do think that the event ability from Joan of Arc is actually quite useful and makes up for maybe the lesser culture reduction. In addition to that, I do think that Joan of Arc just requires less setup, because I do think this whole package is just quite fine in most circumstances, while for Jan Žižka, if you don't have a fitting tactic, he doesn't work that nicely, and I'm not willing to take Jan Žižka if I don't have knowledge about a tactic, most of the times at least. So if I have the chance to take him early but haven't drawn a tactic, often I will pass on him. Because compared to Columbus, I maybe it's I am no, for Columbus I am often willing to go for the gamble. For Jan Žižka, I kind of want to know at least what tactic I might end up going for him. So at the end I will actually put him behind Joan of Arc. I do think if you have the right tactic, he definitely gives you more benefit than Joan of Arc, but you don't always have the right tactic, so I will put him at the lower end of A tier, because of course he is still very powerful, can help you getting the military lead, and so definitely a powerful leader, but not my favorite one. And I do think sometimes I see players just taking him for 3 civil actions or something, and I don't really do that. Unless you maybe have Sun Tzu, which is a very strong combination with Jan Žižka, because then if you have something like medieval army and you are also more likely to have such a tactic, you can maybe get 9 strength out of your tactic with 4 units, which is extremely powerful. And yeah, so that are the leaders. Of course, now you can see that I put no leader in D tier, which is maybe a bit questionable. I thought about maybe just putting Isabella and Genghis Khan in D tier just to have all tiers occupied, but I think it would be a bit harsh to put any leader in D tier. Maybe I have to do it because all tiers have to be there, but I do think for H1 all of the leaders offer some very nice benefit. So, but if you prefer a list where all tiers are occupied, then you can just imagine a list like this, but I at the end make the decision to not put any leader in D tier, because I do think all of them can potentially be quite strong, and none of them is that worse compared to the others that it has to go into D tier. Alright, now we have the wonders that we still need to rank, and we will start with the Forbidden City. A wonder that definitely has grown on me, that I at some point didn't like that much, but I think now I actually like it quite a bit. First, when I thought about which leaders and wonders I will put at which position, I thought about maybe B tier is a very fitting place for it, but I actually decided to move it even 1 tier up in A tier, but it's close. I think it's either a high B tier or low A tier wonder for me. Of course, it takes some steps. But no, I uh, I do think it's quite useful. And first of all, you get the two ignored unhappy workers. And I do think at a time when you will finish the Forbidden City, that is actually very helpful. So when you build the Hanging Gardens, I wonder that is maybe not that great, then sometimes you just have to build it a bit earlier and then you build it at a time when the happy phases are not relevant. But a Forbidden City you maybe most of the times build at the end of age 1 or the beginning of age 2. And I do think then the ignored unhappy workers can be extremely helpful and just allow you to have two more workers that you can put somewhere, maybe in either, if you go for a bit more peaceful game, into something like printing presses, a third lab, a fourth mine, but also just into military. You don't need an H1 happy phase solution, so at the time when the Forbidden City is built, that is actually quite helpful. And compared to the Hanging Gardens, most of the times you have an HA wonder, so you don't have to risk losing the Forbidden City, meaning you can just always rely on those additional happy phases. The downside is, of course, those don't count for something like immigration, impact of happiness, and stuff like this, but I don't think that is that relevant. I do think it's only a small disadvantage. And then it has, in addition to that, a civil action. And I do think civil actions are just extremely valuable to get, which is why I also have Saladin in S tier. It just makes it a lot more smoother to play the game. And also, I do think, especially for the late game, it's important to have a setup with having a lot of civil actions. And then if you have built a Forbidden City earlier and then go with 7 or 8 civil actions in H3, I just think that's a very pleasant way to play them. And especially, I think also if you have an H1 government form, the Forbidden City is just very nice. You maybe have the monarchy, own 5 civil actions, and that definitely can very soon get a bit limiting when you are entering H2. But then you just build a Forbidden City, and you're playing H2 and 6 civil actions, maybe 7 if you have also Code of Laws. The monarchy can serve as a nice long-term solution. You can still upgrade to an H3 government form if you have the signs to spare. Then you have tons of civil actions, can do a lot of stuff in H3. So this combined makes the Forbidden City quite strong for me. One downside is, of course, it doesn't have any culture production, which most of the H1 wonders do. Only the Machu Picchu is a wonder that also doesn't give any culture production. And by culture production, it is time when it is built is maybe not that important, but definitely gets more important over time, and you have to make up for it with actually achieving something with this value that you get out of the Forbidden City. So with all of that, I will actually make the decision to put it into A tier, but also because I put it into B tier and then I had a lot of other wonders and I thought, I don't like that one more than the Forbidden City, and then I had most of the wonders just cluttered around in B and C tier, and A tier was almost completely free, so at the end I decided to move the Forbidden City one tier up, and I do think it's a very useful wonder. Then the next wonder that we are having is the Himeji Castle. And the Himeji Castle is maybe a wonder that I'm undervaluing, but maybe also one that some players overvalue. But I think I maybe undervalue it because it's actually the H1 wonder together with the Taj Mahal that I had the least out of my 2 last World Championships. And the reason why I don't like the Himeji Castle that much is that at the time when it is built, you get a bit of strength, you get a bit of culture, but it's a big investment, and I think it very often will just be better to maybe invest into more economical benefits instead of the Himeji Castle on one hand. On the other hand, when you are then entering the late game in H3 and maybe also already H2, the ability to sacrifice just always threatening that is just extremely useful. You can maybe a lot more easily threaten to defend against wars, threaten to defend against aggressions, makes it possible to play a bit more greedily, and maybe then if you go on the aggressive side yourself, you will go for a war, the war will be resolved, maybe it's the end of the game, you can sacrifice with the Himeji Castle, maybe an air force or something, get 5 additional strength, 3 culture for sacrificing, and with that get 8 additional culture basically for the war, culture swing even against a player that you declared a war on. So I do think in the late game it's just extremely pleasant to have the Himeji Castle, and maybe I did undervalue that for some time, but at a time when it is built, of course the 2 strength can be useful, and if you have just a lot of rock production and nothing else to do, definitely go for it, and maybe you should also a bit more often than I do aim towards it, but I oftentimes just maybe want to invest my resources a bit differently. So for me, it was at the end a question, should I put it in C tier or do I at the end go up to B tier just because of the very nice late game potential? And I do think I will end up putting it at B tier with the amount of times I've taken it and how my feeling towards it is. Maybe I could put it in C tier, but I do think then in the late game it maybe is just extremely helpful, and with that I will put it in B tier. Then the next wonder that we are having is the Machu Picchu. So the other wonder that doesn't produce any culture by itself. And the Machu Picchu can potentially be quite powerful, but it also can be a bit of a trap and lead you into a wrong direction. And it's a bit difficult to maybe make really good use out of it, because you ideally want to go for iron, you want to go for irrigation, but in order to spend all of those resources and food efficiently, you ideally need additional science and additional civil actions, and then being able to set up iron irrigation. Maybe you don't immediately have to go for the irrigation, just taking it in hand, but setting that up, having that available. And in addition to that, also making it that you have maybe some additional civil actions or science production, or ideally both, I do think is quite difficult to achieve. And if you are on low science and then produce all of those resources and food, and you are on low civil actions, you will sometimes just a lot end in corruption a lot, and you are not really able to make use out of the additional production. So with that, I will put it in C tier, but if you are able to make it work, it can be an extremely strong wonder, and also maybe works very nicely with Michelangelo, because Michelangelo really likes it to have a lot of resource production to maybe build as many wonders as humanly possible, and then being able to get the Machu Picchu and go up to a lot of resource production early can really lead to it, and being able to take 2 or 3 more wonders afterwards, which gives you a very strong position most of the time. So I do think it works quite nicely with that, and if the Machu Picchu is in the game, you definitely can value maybe the iron and the irrigation a bit more highly, because if the situation is right and you think that you can actually invest the resources out of the Machu Picchu nicely, it definitely can be a very strong wonder. But I think I don't go for it that often, and sometimes will rather go for one of the other wonders, so I will put it in C tier, but that yeah, doesn't mean that it can be quite strong if the circumstances are right, and maybe it's if you are just playing towards making the circumstances right, and the Machu Picchu will maybe be higher on your list. Then the next wonder that we're having is the St. Peter's Basilica. At some point, I think I even put the St. Peter's Basilica in S tier because I really liked it for a while. Nowadays, it definitely has fallen down in how much I am liking it. But it, of course, can still be very useful. It fixes your happy faces. You maybe don't need any happy face technology for the rest of the game, or you can maybe just go for dramas and operas and very nicely solve your happy faces with that. But it's still a bit of a clunky resource cost with the 1/6 resource cost step. And yeah, just getting the happy faces and a bit of culture, I just don't like that much. But it has then in the late game, of course, can give you a lot of additional happy faces. Works very nicely if you go for a bit of a culture-oriented setup, because then, as said, you can go for dramas or operas, have that as a happy face solution, and don't need to bother investing into any happy face solution. So it can be quite nice at the end, same as the Himeji Castle. Was the question, do I want to put it down in C tier? Do I want to put it up in B tier? And I do think it's very close. I do like it less nowadays than the Forbidden City, because the civil action from the Forbidden City I think is just very useful. And in the early stage of the game, the Forbidden City sometimes even gives you more happy faces, because sometimes you don't have a free religion, you build a St. Peter's Basilica, but then you have only one happy face from it, and then you maybe actively have to build a religion to get the additional one, and sometimes with the Forbidden City you just have the 2 ignored unhappy workers, you don't need any religion, you don't need anything, you can put all of the other workers, at least for now, in some other areas, and yeah, with that, I think that I like the St. Peter's Basilica less than the Forbidden City, but it can be quite powerful, so I do think I will put it in the lower end of B tier, right behind the Himeji Castle. Those wonders feel somewhat similar for me. Both are producing 2 cultures, both are offering a benefit that is stronger in the late game, but maybe isn't needed that much, and I'm more often trying to set up some stuff that I maybe really need immediately. and because of that I don't have those wonders that highly, but B tier is of course still quite fine, but I definitely for both of them considered also putting them in C tier, but for now I will put them in B tier. Alright, the next wonder is of course my special favorite wonder, my most taken wonder from all ages in the last World Championship, and of course there can only be one right place for the Silk Road, and that is S tier. And I don't have to say anything else to it. Or maybe I do. Now, the Silk Road, at some point, I considered to be maybe in D or C tier. But then I think I saw it 1 or 2 times where it was put to really good use. I started to take it more often, and it just feels always very, very pleasant if you have that build. But of course, it has to be considered, why is the Silk Road actually that strong? And maybe it's not that easy to answer. But I mean, you're getting one science production, and I do think the science production is very useful, and then you're getting the benefit you are able to play a yellow card per turn for additional value. Most of the times you are not able to play a yellow card every turn, that's just unrealistic. But sometimes you at least maybe do for half of the turns where you have the Silk Road, or maybe for 75% of the turns, and then the Silk Road is giving you a science plus maybe 0.5 or 0.75 resources, science, food, and that is already quite nice compared to the universitas that is just giving 2 science, but the Silk Road gives an additional culture production, which maybe at the time when it is built is not the most relevant thing, but it can still be nice, I think, building your civilization up in a way so that you are increasing your economy, but at the same time, just as a nice side effect, you get some culture production. So it's a bit difficult because I do think it's generally good advice to not focus on building culture in H1 or early H2. But on the other hand, if you manage to build up your civilization in a nice way and sneak in a bit of culture with your wonders, or maybe a bit with the leader a little bit, it definitely can be quite beneficial. And so I do think that you get a 2 culture, you don't fall behind in culture, and at the same time you get some nice economical benefits, is quite nice. In addition to that, you are already able to get some benefits out of the Silk Road before this even finished. So sometimes you maybe have only the first step built for 2 or 3 turns, and you can already get some value out of it, and that is of course also another small benefit. And then later in maybe H2 or H3, when you maybe have an H2 government form and out of the sudden a lot of civil actions, it first of all gets a lot more easier to maybe actually play a yellow card every turn, and then really make maybe 1 science plus another amount of 1 value. But sometimes you have even a variety of yellow cards, and then you can even decide what you want to get for it at a turn. Do you want to play a reserves force first for resources? Do you want to use the frugality for additional food? Do you want to play the revolutionary idea? Of course, most of the times you can't decide between all of the 3 different things, but it's definitely not that rarely possible to at least maybe decide between 2 resources and which you're actually needing more, which is also a benefit of the Silk Road, and then you can actually take what you need more. Then of course there are also some nice late game things that the Silk Road allows, mainly, or the only one that I want to mention, is the ability to play a patriotism, which is of course generally useful in all ages, for 2 instead of only 1 additional military action. And I do think that's extremely valuable because you don't maybe need a lot of military action to still be threatening quite some strength and threatening to go for a war. Just with having a patriotism in hand, you can just keep it in hand all the time, and then the players always have to think about, alright, if he goes for war now, he could play that patriotism, get 2 additional military actions, and then he can actually build some strength. I have to be careful. So only for the threat of that, it can be very nice to just make sure to have a patriotism in hand in H3. And then of course, if you actually want to go for a war, that 1 military action often makes a big difference in how big you can make your war. So that is also a nice little side effect, or can be very big, but of course doesn't have an effect every game, but also a nice thing to have in mind. And of course all the yellow cards where you get even 2 things like stockpile can be a very nice combination with the Silk Road. Cultural heritage can be very nice, and then of course all of the patriotisms. And now, I personally like the Silk Road a lot. Recently in Discord, someone shared some pick rates and win rates of the Leaders and Wonders in high-level tournament games. I didn't take a very close look at it, but one thing that I did see in the discussion when I read very quickly through it was that one of the wonders with the highest win rate from all of the wonders is the Silk Road, and I think you have to be very careful about those stats because sometimes they can be misleading you, but of course if it serves my purpose I will now mention it and yeah, will try to make my point more valid with it. So yeah, the Silk Road definitely one of my favorite wonders, and for me it definitely deserves to be an S tier. The next wonder will go at the opposite end of the spectrum in D tier. The Taj Mahal definitely can sometimes be nice to be built, especially if you have just a lot of resource production and you are then able to take it for free. But even with the ability that you can take it for free, sometimes, or not even that rarely, it will be the right decision to not take it. I do think the ideal way maybe to play the Taj Mahal is actually to take it for free maybe when you go for your H1 leader, and then only finish at the end of H2 after you have built your economy, because then I do think paying 8 resources and getting 3 culture out of this wonder is actually quite strong. So that is maybe the ideal way to play. The problem with that maybe ideal way of playing it is that you have the Taj Mahal lying around all the time, and there are some very strong H2 wonders where it can be quite bad if you just block yourself from going for that wonder, like the ocean liner service, also Harvard College, potentially Suez Canal, Railroad. Not having the ability to take those wonders, especially if you're having a lot of resource production, which is maybe the ideal circumstance when you also want to take the Taj Mahal. But then if you don't finish it quickly enough, you might block yourself from the H2 wonders. And if you finish it quickly enough, then you maybe finish it at a time where the 3 culture reduction is not the most relevant thing to get, and it could maybe be better if you just would have invested your resources into something else, maybe one of the other H1 wonders. Nonetheless, of course, if you have the ability to take it for free, definitely consider it, and especially if you're having some resource production, then yeah, it can be quite nice to just take it for free, but it's very rarely only that I think the Taj Mahal is taken without the discount. So no, I do think it deserves to be in D tier at the end, but that of course doesn't mean that there aren't situations where it can be quite useful. And also, if you are interested in a deeper discussion about the Taj Mahal, Danny Boy, a very strong player, has made a few videos on YouTube, and his channel you find also linked in the overview of all of the channels that I have in the description of my videos. And there he made one video only talking about the Taj Mahal and when it is the right situation to go for it. So definitely check it out if you're interested in some Taj Mahal discussion. Alright, now we have 2 wonders left, and one wonder is the Universitas, which I also rate very highly, and I also will end up putting it in S tier, but actually behind the Silk Road. I think it would also be fine to put it in front of it, but I personally will put it behind the Silk Road. And if you remember my list about Leaders and Wonders in the World Championship, then in both of the last 2 World Championships, the Silk Road and Universitas were the wonders that I picked the most from H1, and even with quite a bit of a lead. So I think it definitely makes sense for me to put them in S tier. Of course, the sheer amount of how often I've taken them doesn't really say a lot about how strong they are. Maybe some other wonders are very highly contested because they are so strong, but I do think in this particular case, it's just because those wonders are just extremely useful. If you are on Iron Mines, building a Universitas is just a perfect thing to do, because one big downside of going into Iron early is, especially if you don't have any additional science from a leader or wonder, that you are quite low in science, and that can be a bit limiting. Setting up a government form can be quite difficult. You have to go for a revolution, which sometimes there is not really the right time to do so. But then if you have some iron mines, quickly build that Universitas, out of the sudden you're sitting at 4 science production and you are ready to go. And you don't even requiring any workers for it. You don't need any science investment to go into it, because if you go into alchemy, that gives you the same increase costs a little bit less resources, but you have to invest 4 science into it, and I do think not having to invest it for science can be quite beneficial. And also both the Silk Road and Universitas, which I maybe forgot to mention when I talked about the Silk Road, can be extremely strong if you get them early. And if you maybe just had HA, you didn't commit to a wonder, then it's your next turn and you see one of those wonders coming down the road, can be extremely strong to wait for them. And I will actually sometimes on purpose leave myself in a position when those wonders are in the game to not commit to an HA wonder, because getting one of those wonders first, being able to finish them quite quickly can be very, very strong. And but also later on, they can still offer some very nice benefits. So both of those wonders I will end up putting in S tier. And that means we have only one wonder left, and that is the Great Wall, which gives you +1 strength per infantry and artillery unit that you are having, a happy face and a culture production. It is a bit costly, takes 4 civil actions to build, but now I actually like the Great Wall quite a bit. I don't manage to go for it that often, so maybe I should put it a bit lower on the list, but I think the Great Wall can just be extremely useful, and I will actually put it in A tier before the Forbidden City. Of course, maybe one natural wonder to compare the Great Wall to is the Himeji Castle. And yeah, the Himeji Castle produces 1 more culture than the Great Wall, but the Great Wall has this happy face, which I do think is often quite useful, especially when you are maybe building it at the beginning of H2. The happy face, not that rarely, will just lead to 1 worker that is freed up, that you can maybe then again put into the military, get even more strength out of the Great Wall. And I do think the Great Wall is maybe the best wonder from H1 if you really want to go for an aggressive game with a lot of strength. Early in the game, the Great Wall is maybe not offering you that much strength. Maybe you have a Legion tactic, then it's something like 3 strength. Maybe you have a Phalanx tactic, then it's something like 2 strength. So that's a similar amount as the Himeji Castle, but you don't get the ability to sacrifice. Or at this point, it's maybe not that great, but also maybe the ability to sacrifice, you don't often need that early in H2 or something. Sometimes it can already be useful. But same as the Himeji Castle, I do think the Great Wall has tons of potential when it goes into the late game. Is of course a bit dependent on maybe what H2 or H3 tactic you are drawing, but it definitely can be possible to easily get 4 strength out of this, sometimes even 6, 7, 8 strength, and getting that amount of strength out of an H1 wonder is just extremely powerful. The happy face is useful, and if you are getting that big amount of strength, I do think that is more stronger than the sacrifice ability of the Himeji Castle. Just having the strength upright, being able to win strength events with it, declaring war with it, it just has this very big potential. So because of that, even it's a bit difficult to build, because of the happy face often being quite useful, and I then like the happy face plus the 1 culture more, plus the strength and the 2 culture that the Himeji Castle is offering. Of course, the Great Wall takes more steps, but I do think not that rarely it will be worth it to go for those. And I do think if the situation is right, the Great Wall is quite often taken. Now, maybe it could be considered to move it a bit lower, but I do think just because of the big potential, it is quite strong, but even if it's not used to its fullest potential, it can still give you an amount of benefits that at the end is just very nice. Of course, it can be very strong together with Genghis Khan, getting 4 strength out of the tactic with just relying on infantry units, which is otherwise not possible. And then also getting the Great Wall really can allow you to go for some aggressive early game military pushes. Also the Great Wall plus Barbarossa can of course be quite strong, building a lot of swordsmen or warriors with Barbarossa and then getting a lot of strength out of the Great Wall. Also maybe having Janchushka with that and a Legion tactic and building 4 swordsmen can really put you at a lot of strength, and that often might be enough to pull off an aggression or maybe a big war. And while that is also possible with the Himeji Castle, you maybe don't get as much strength out of it, and you have to sacrifice if you want to get more out of this war, or maybe you want to make it more likely that aggression is useful. While if you have an aggressive game plan, the Great Wall is just giving you the strength upright. So I do think I like this wonder more than the Himeji Castle, and will put it in A tier. Maybe now the wonders are a little bit too high, because the difference in how often I take those wonders and then those 2 in the top is quite big. So maybe it could have been fine to move all of those a little bit downwards, and then either have no or maybe only the Great Wall in HA, but at the end they decided, because I do think all of those wonders are also quite useful, to make the list like this. Alright, and with that we are finished. I hope I could mention maybe some interesting things about those leaders. You could really talk a lot about them. I do think maybe it could also be an interesting format to just pick one particular leader and then go really do a really deep dive into put a lot of combos and strengths and weaknesses, and maybe talk even more about one particular card or two particular cards that maybe can easily be compared, like Joan of Arc and Zizka, maybe also Genghis Khan. Could be interesting, and Danny Boyle actually did something like this with the Taj Mahal, so I do think that could be an interesting format. And I hope I didn't forget to mention anything that I wanted to mention. It was quite difficult for me to put this list together. It's very difficult to compare the value of someone like Columbus and Joan of Arc. At the end, it's just a little bit of a feeling thing, also a thing that will change again. A year ago, this list would have looked different, and I definitely think 1 year in the future it again will look different, but that is how I'm somewhat happy with it. And will at the end let this list be like it is. Alright, so with that you can now start playing your H1 in the stage 4 of the World Championship. Of course, also the stage 4 having started means that not in that far in the future I will be able to start covering the World Championship again, which I'm definitely excited for. And until then, we will try to do the 2 remaining tier lists and then maybe see if there's still some time, depending on how quickly the games will be played. And yeah, then I say thanks for watching. Definitely let me know in the comments what you see completely different, and where I maybe put a leader way too low or way too high. And yeah, then thanks for watching, have a nice time, and see you in the next video.